All right, welcome back to Psychology, everybody. I'm your Professor Ryan Keith, and this is exciting. It is our last live stream of the semester. I hope that these have been helpful so far. Today we got a nice mix of questions about psychology stuff, some class policy stuff, and of course, COVID, kind of what's on everybody's mind these days. I'm going to try to move us kind of quick through stuff, but want to make sure I hit some highlights. Today, as we get ready for finals week, I want to make sure that I really hit the most important things. So I'm going to start with some updates at the top and then go ahead and just move through the questions that you guys have. I think we're going to shoot for, again, like kind of a half-hour stream, but if we run a little bit over, that's all right. If you're watching... Well, I'll get into the announcements, and then we'll talk a little bit about if you're watching this concurrently or not, what that means for us this week. Cool. And if you get a chance, just let me know in the chat if it looks like the stream is actually working or not. If you're getting audio or not. I know that the quality is not always the best, but oh, super cool. I think we're doing okay. Just let me know if things are going cool. All right, so a few updates. One of the most popular topics of conversation lately seems to be our final exam, which is looming next week. I know some of you guys have instructors who have already opened their finals. You've knocked those bad boys out, and you are done with those classes, which is awesome because it gives you plenty of time to focus on my class and our final. I'm going to talk a little bit about the final format and what it means for your grades. The format of the final is that your final exam is a cumulative exam. It's your opportunity to show everything you've learned this semester. I know that there's been a lot that's been different this semester, but this is something that should be kind of normal. Good reminder of what a regular semester is like. Can you guys hear me? Okay, it's telling me maybe my audio is not good, so just let me know if you can hear me or not. But the finals format is that it is cumulative. It covers everything in the class. And because it's cumulative, it's going to be a longer exam. It's tough for me to cover everything in the semester in the space of, like 30 questions. So instead, your final exam is going to be roughly twice as long as a regular exam would be. And the time limit is going to be about twice as long to make up for that also. As far as the specific format of the exam, it's going to be multiple choice. It sounds like our Instacart order is here, which is great. I'm going to hope somebody goes ahead and grabs that for me here real quick. But as far as the format of the final exam, it's going to be mostly multiple choice like your other exams have been. And then if you're in a class like developmental or social psychology where you've had some short answer or essay questions, you guys can look forward to some of that too. Excuse me. As far as how that final exam is gonna become available to you guys, it's going to become available on the first day of finals week and remain available through the entirety of finals week, which I think carries it through maybe May 2nd or May 1st. It's whatever that Saturday is. That's the last day to go ahead and take that. But you want to do it just like your other tests. You don't want to wait till the last minute to go ahead and take that bad boy. You really want to get in. You want to get in on time and give yourself plenty of time to take that. Among other things, you want to make sure you have time to study for it, time to take it when you feel fresh and not when you have just enough time to get it done. And then, of course, time to run into a problem and let me know so I can fix it. More than other tests, this time limit really is super hard because there's a deadline by which I have to have your grades submitted. And if we push this thing too late, I won't have time to grade it. So we want to make sure we get that in. I've had a number of students ask me about how the final exam is going to work in terms of grades. I know we've talked about this a little bit, but I want to make sure I really get this clear. The final exam can replace up to 2 of your lowest grades or 2 missed exam grades or test grades. Functionally, what this means is that in your class, you have... let's say I know all my classes have different number of tests, but let's say you were in a class that had 7 regular tests. Functionally, you would have 9 test grades, 7 regular ones, and then the final, which counts twice, and then only 7 of those would count, right? Meaning that the 2 lowest ones get dropped. If you have missed a couple of tests, you could take the final and replace those. If you've done poorly on a couple of tests, you could take the final and replace those. If you did poorly on one test, the final would replace that one, but not others. One of your final scores could drop, right? And as a result, your final absolutely cannot hurt you. There are some students who want to know whether or not they should skip the final. And I mean, it's possible to go ahead and skip the final. You can. You'll get zeros on it, but those zeros will drop. And because this semester there's been so much that's been up in the air about when stuff is going live, when stuff is getting graded. I'm running a little bit behind on my grading. I think, probably the best advice I can give is to go ahead and just take that final. That way you're going to be in good shape on it, and you won't have any regrets, right? There won't be any counterfactual thinking about whether or not you should have taken the final. So yeah, final exam, get in there, take it. It'll be available all of next week. Really big announcement. I'm going to post something to Canvas. I hope that a bunch of you guys get the information here. Free money. This isn't specifically about this class. It's about your stuff at Santa Fe in general. Santa Fe recently received a pretty sizable grant to then give money to students who have been impacted by COVID. It's something that's called the COVID-19 Emergency Aid Grant, and it is money that is available to students who have been impacted by the coronavirus financially. What specifically does that mean? It kind of means if you've been impacted in any way, which I think pretty much everybody has. If you are somebody whose income has been reduced because you're working fewer hours or not at all as a result of coronavirus, you could qualify for this. If your expenses have increased, you're having to get food differently than you would have. Or maybe you have kids who got food at school, or you yourself would have gotten lunch at your public school, but now you can't and you have to eat at home. That's changing your financial situation. If your power bill, your water bill, your cable bill have gone up because of this, if it would be helpful for you to purchase new technology so that you and everyone else in your household can get your schoolwork done, like you're somebody, that means you've been impacted. Even if you're somebody that you are having to pay more for, let's say, children's programming so that your kids or cousins or whoever can get entertainment on the reg so you can get your stuff done, that's a financial burden you're having to shoulder as a result of this. So if you want that free money, there's going to be a link down in the show notes in the description that I forgot to put in before the stream. You probably noticed I didn't get the stream info up, but I'll go ahead and drop this in the chat here. There's a link. It's sfcollege.edu/COVID-19 aid. If you go to that link, there's information on the grant and how to apply for it. They ask you to give your information, a summary of how you've been impacted, and I think kind of the worst possible thing, which is you have to say how much money you think you should get. Now, my advice is kind of like the advice someone gave me when I was in a class where a professor asked what grade I thought I deserved, right? Like, impact has been on you. Oh, no. Well, this is not good. Well, go ahead and total up how you feel you've been impacted, and then go ahead and submit your best estimate of what you think you need. Cool. A few other things. If you have questions about the end of the semester, your grades and options, like should you be looking at the SU option? Do you need to be dropping classes like the drop with refund? What can you do if you are horribly behind? Get in touch with me. But I answer, well, I shouldn't say I answer. I have a guest who answers these questions and a lot more. A podcast episode assigned this week to everybody was the interview with an expert, Ask an Expert, COVID-19 edition with Dr. Nicole Keith, one of our fantastic advisors here at Santa Fe. She answers a lot of really great questions that you guys might have about stuff like registration, SU option, incomplete, stuff like that. The last thing you may have noticed is that in some of my classes, material is light this week. I recorded on Tuesday roughly, hour and a half, 2 hours of material, and then found out that my microphone was not working. So rather than giving you guys a bunch of silent films to watch, I just figured maybe you've gotten enough material for the semester and you didn't need more stuff to study. So, cool. Well, let me go ahead and jump into questions. Again, as always, if you have more questions, follow-up questions, things that you want to know, go ahead and ask those in the chat, and I'll be happy to answer them. But let's jump into our first question about the live stream. Last live stream, I couldn't get the chat to pop up. Do you have any idea why this might be? No, I have absolutely no idea. If anybody else has ideas about how to get the chat to show up on this one, go ahead and drop it in the chat. It should show up automatically. I don't know if you're looking on your phone or your tablet versus your computer, if it looks different. But if you can't get to the chat, generally it's been pretty light anyway, so I don't know that you've been missing all that much stuff. I'll make this deal though. If you have a question and you can't get to the chat, just go ahead and text me at 327-8259 and I'll answer your questions there. Another question about the final exam. Hi, Professor Keith. Will there be a study guide for the final exam? If not, do you suggest studying past tests? Will that be beneficial for the final exam? Every semester, I think about putting together a study guide, and then I never really get to it because there's just so much stuff that I ask you guys to look at and think about and learn about. And ultimately, when it comes down to the final exam, I build it based on what I think is important, what I think has worked, and what I think hasn't. I don't emphasize that as much. But as far as studying for the final, I think looking back at past tests is one of the very best things you can do. Among other things, I don't necessarily record all the podcasts or all the videos or write your textbook, but I do write all of your tests and I do write the final. So those previous tests, even though I'm not going to copy questions from them to the final, they're a really good indicator of what I think is important and what kinds of questions are going to show up on the final, since the same person wrote those questions and also wrote or will be writing your final exam questions. So looking back at those past tests is a really good one. Doing things like self-quizzing is really good. We've talked about some other techniques in past live streams, so go ahead and check those out if you want to know more about really good ways to study for the final exam. But absolutely, things like self-quizzing or doing flashcards where you have like a term on one side and then nothing on the other, coming up with essay prompts, things like that. Working together, quizzing each other is a really good one. Another question. I was wondering what the final day that the assignments are due on. Is it going to be Monday, April 27th by midnight? I just need to know how many days I have left to get my work done. I know that there's been a ton of stuff up in the air about like when things are going to get done. I scrambled really quickly at the beginning of this whole like COVID thing. And ultimately, I know it's a little bit confusing, but officially all of your work is due on the dates that they were originally assigned. But I extended the due dates for everything that was originally going to be due. I extended those due dates through the 25th, which is tomorrow, right? Meaning that ever since we had this move to online or virtualized instruction, everything that was due, you've got those due dates extended through tomorrow. Everything for the current week is going to be due like normal on this coming Monday. Now, it might be the Monday of finals week, but it just gives everybody like the weekend and the Monday after to get it in. So for everything that is overdue, you're not going to get penalized for it being late, but it'll be due tomorrow. That makes sure I have plenty of time to grade that stuff that's late. Everything that's due this week is going to be due on Monday as usual. And then everything for finals week, which is your final exam, will be due at the end of finals week, which should be the Saturday of finals week. I think that might be May 1st. I can go ahead and check here. Nope, that's May 2nd. So the final exam will be due on May 2nd. Next question also, is our grade on Canvas our final grade? No, absolutely not, at least not yet. Because as you guys know, I am nowhere near done grading everything. I'm usually a couple of weeks behind on grading anyway. This semester, I'm even farther behind than usual. Idea of where you are so that you know whether or not you should take the final, even though my policy on the final is that you should absolutely go ahead and take it. I know that it's a lot to ask to say, like, study for and take the final, even if numerically you shouldn't take it, but it's like, the final's there. You should do it. And it might be a forgiveness that you can drop your two lowest grades, but you're doing yourself a favor if you just assume you need to do it. So, I think that's it for like general kind of like course questions. I'm going to dig into a little bit of class specific material next year. I've got some questions from social and then developmental psychology. Coming from my social psychology class, question asker says, this week's Hidden Brain podcast has me thinking about my own struggles with stereotype threat. Major life changes during high school caused me to graduate by the skin of my teeth, and I dragged my feet for a couple of years afterwards before enrolling in college courses. Even though I'm doing great academically now, I still often feel uncomfortable being older than my classmates and watching many of them virtually graduate this year. In the context of social psychology, is there any advice you would give me for feeling less like an imposter? Well, I think it's really great that this question asker uses the term imposter specifically, since what they're describing, like they're describing stereotype threat, which is when a stereotype that's present impacts our performance, at least in a not great way, right? So for example, if you are older than your peers, you might think about stereotypes that older people are slower and don't learn as well, these problematic stereotypes, and then that will cause you to do poorly, in part because you're so stressed about complying with that stereotype that it impacts your performance. We see the same thing among student athletes and students of color, right? That they struggle when these stereotypes are activated. But also that use of that term imposter demonstrates that we all struggle with that thing, this imposter complex, that especially in really competitive areas like in academics, in finances, even in our attempts to adult, we see the people around us apparently keeping their lives together. We know that we're struggling to do the same, so we feel like imposters, like we don't deserve to be where we are, right? And one of the best ways to not suffer from the imposter complex is to do your best to not suffer from FOMO. Social media begets comparisons to others, and the more that we compare ourselves to others, the more we suffer from an imposter complex, because ultimately what people post online is not their real lives, but the best versions of their lives. One of the things I think is really great is to see where like streamers stream and to see the settings around them. You can see like I've got this, very carefully framed shot with like me and half of my electric guitar, and my webcam recently changed so it complies better with like live streaming stuff, so you can't see as well that all the stuff around me. But even like if I were to point down a little bit, you'd see right the album covers, right? But the idea is I've got this like very carefully constructed view of what I've got here so that you have this idea of who I am as a person, right? There are books, there's my guitar, all this stuff. But if I were to swivel this camera around, one of the things you'd see is that my office is a total mess. It's like an absolute disaster area. And even though like I maybe like literally, not just figuratively, have like this careful slice of my existence that I share with you, there's all this other stuff that's just out of frame. There's this other stuff that's okay, cool. There's this other stuff that's just out of frame that you don't get to see, right? So the less we compare ourselves to others, the more successful we're going to be, because that stereotype threat and that imposter complex is lessened. The other thing to do, and this comes from cognitive behavioral therapy, is to replace problematic thoughts with more adaptive ones. So, for example, if we were to look at the stats on the number of non-traditional students that we have at a place like Santa Fe, you'd see that being a few years older than your peers is not only unusual, it's not only not unusual, it's downright normal. And not only that, we can say, like, rather than thinking about the fact that you're behind, it's really easy to feel behind on anything if you feel like you're older than other people who are buying houses, having kids, having jobs, right? Rather than thinking about being behind, think about yourself being ahead in another respect. It's not that you're behind everybody else who's graduating. It's that you took that time to develop valuable life skills, whether those skills came from work or from family or from friends. Maybe you'll learn some really hard lessons that other people have yet to learn. But in any case, that time isn't wasted. It's just invested somewhere else. So yeah, thinking about things in that way, like using that cognitive behavioral and behavioral therapy, can actually help you out a lot. Another specific question, and I think this is actually, it's going to sound really specific to social psychology, but it's a really good question for any class. My question is about the research and analysis project. And this is a research and analysis project that is one of my favorites from social psychology. I asked students in this assignment to leverage what they've been learning over the course of several weeks and try to think about how they would use that to be horrible, evil, terrible reality TV producers trying to get the worst behavior out of contestants and participants. And the student's question here is, I don't really watch TV, I don't follow any of the suggested TV shows, so is there a possibility to do the research on a different basis? Number 2, can I do the research, for example, on social issues and collective behavior? And 3, suggestions about question 1 or 2. To answer these two questions, first of all, answer to number 1 is no. And number 2 is no as a result of the answer no to number 1. And this isn't just that I want to be inflexible. It's that I want to make people who have not yet had the wonderful opportunity to watch reality TV, I want to make you watch reality TV. Because there are a couple of ways that you can watch it, right? If you watch reality TV the way, for example, my mother would. My mother hates reality television. She never watches it. She'll sit down to watch it. She recently watched The Tiger King. And I asked her what her view on The Tiger King was. Like, what did she think about it? Oh, and you know what? She didn't send it to me, but that's all right. I asked her what she thought of Tiger King, and she thought that everybody was horrible, and she hated every person on there. And I think that's because like she sat down to watch it as this like genuinely fun and entertaining thing. But if you take a step back from that, right, and you try to do a little bit more meta-analysis of something like Tiger King, you say, yeah, they're all horrible. Like the point is not to love these characters. It's not to find a hero that you follow and enjoy. The point is to analyze and say, like, why are they horrible, right? And in watching something like reality TV, if you sit down just to enjoy the story, you're probably going to be miserable because mostly reality TV is populated by miserable people. And so if you take a step back and say, why are these people so miserable, right? That allows us to practice a little bit of our psychology stuff. And then second, if you take one more step back and you say, not just, why are these people terrible, but take a step back and say, why am I seeing what I am seeing? Why is this the narrative I'm being presented with? These producers recorded thousands of hours of stuff. How did they distill it down to 40 hours of programming? What specifically are they trying to show us? You can do a little bit of that analysis and look at not just the social psychology of the interactions of these people and who they are, but also like, why are we getting the behavior we're getting? Who is doing what here, and why are we seeing what we are seeing? As a producer, right, if you're seeing bad behavior, for example, among these contestants, how did they get that? Did they make sure, for example, that there was very little food and lots of alcohol, right? Do they make sure that these people live in really uncomfortable situations and then release them to express that frustration with each other, right? And part of the enjoyment of an assignment like this is to get you to engage with stuff that you're not used to engaging with. And if you are, to engage with it in a new way. Even if you're not taking social psychology, wonderful opportunity to watch Tiger King. Love is Blind, really good show. Very bad, but also very good. Watch it through that psychology lens and you'll have a good time. For a few questions from developmental psychology, though what's interesting is in developmental psychology, we're talking about ageism and age and discrimination there. In social psychology, we're talking about stuff like stereotyping and discrimination. And then in general psychology, we're also talking about social psychology. So this stuff applies all the way across. One of my developmental psychology students asked, where did benevolent prejudice beliefs like old people being wise and kind come from? I think, there are a lot of cultures where older adults are respected and revered, and in our current Western culture, that's not necessarily the case. And I think it's a natural thing to assume that people who are older are going to be wise, that they're going to have knowledge that the rest of us don't. But we need to be careful as we apply that to a whole group of people. Like it's a natural assumption to say that people who have more experience will have more information. And if they have more information, then they will also be wise. But the problem with that is that it assumes some things about these people, like that older adults won't just have more information, but our elders will also know how to apply that information in useful ways. And there are a lot of older adults who aren't necessarily wise. The assumption of older adults being kind, right, is tied in with this assumption of like helplessness or harmlessness, that older adults aren't just good-natured, but they're kind and that they are benevolent and that they are harmless and that they are harmless because they couldn't do any harm, because they are weak and fragile and frail, right? It's this idea kind of like a declawed cat or a defanged snake or something, right? That as we get older, we lose our abilities and so we become harmless and helpless. And so in that way, like we can think about how these kinds of stereotypes, even though they seem like good things, like I like people who are kind and harmless, I'm assuming that they're kind and harmless because they're helpless, because they don't have the ability to harm anybody, right? So we can see where that becomes problematic. And finding the sources of these kinds of benevolent prejudice, right? It can be uncomfortable. I've talked with a couple of people recently who they attended a seminar on implicit bias, and their big problem is that they don't believe implicit bias is a thing. They say, well, I don't think, for example, that benevolent prejudice is a thing because I can't think of any of the times that I've thought anything racist. I can't think of any of the times that I've done anything sexist. Therefore, it doesn't exist, right? And being willing to re-examine some of these thoughts, it's a tough thing, but it can help us see where our beliefs come from and help us be more willing to examine, like, are there more constructive ways to think about other people? Another question, are initiatives like senior citizen grocery shopping hour during quarantine harmful? They say that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and it's entirely possible that some of these moves that are meant to be helpful can be harmful. For example, is it problematic to take the most vulnerable elements of our population and distill them all down into one place at one time? Maybe so, right? That's where we have to make sure that, just like we see in education, we have to make sure that we don't just have the right intentions, but these things are executed correctly. So beyond that, like, I don't really know. This is done for medical reasons, but there are a lot of trade-offs. Is it possible that we can end up, for example, causing people to feel discriminated against, or cause them to feel marginalized, or activate stereotype threat through a lot of our moves to take care of our elders? Yes. Is it maybe worth it to protect their well-being and health? Also yes, right? Like, if people feel bad but ultimately they don't die, it might be worth it, right? Speaking of dying, another question from developmental psychology: why do we as a society have such an insensitivity to death? For example, in the midst of the virus, people see the thousands that have died but see a number, not a person's life. And this is not really just an our culture thing. This ties in with something we've discussed in social psychology at length, called the construal level theory. Okay, it looks like we've got some questions coming in through my text here, but that's okay. I'll get to these in just a second. All right, so cool. We'll take a look at those in a second. But construal level theory, and what construal level theory says is this: it's based on this idea about, like, how we construe the meanings of things. Construal level theory says that the farther something is from us, the more abstract it is, and the more abstract something is, the less emotionally impactful it is. So if we think about the flip side of this, and I realize the date on my thing here is wrong. It says April 17th, but it's actually April 24th. That's fine. If we think about the flip side of this, when it comes to persuasion, the identifiable victim effect says that if we have a vivid, identifiable victim, a message will be more powerful. Think about powerful, persuasive messages like in television advertisements for the ASPCA, when they show these, like, skinny, miserable, abused animals and Sarah McLachlan's playing in the background, and it tugs at your emotional heartstrings, right? They don't tell you just about the number of abused or abandoned or malnourished or isolated animals in the United States. They show you specific examples. Because ultimately, like, your brain doesn't know what to do with these big abstract numbers. Whether we talk about, like, big abstract numbers like the number of people who might be killed by COVID, the tens of thousands of people, the millions of people who are going to be infected, right? That doesn't necessarily mean a whole lot. The same way that if I try to think about big numbers with income, right? Like, if I try to think about not even relatively big numbers, if the stimulus, $1,200, I think, like, nice, $1,200, that's good. But I have a hard time thinking about, like, what does $1,200 really mean unless I peg it to something that's, like, real to me. Like, how much is my mortgage or my rent or my power bill, or how many pizzas is $1,200, right? Like, I have to think of something real. And, both social psychologists and politicians have understood this for some time. So if we say, for example, returning to school will increase the mortality rate by 3%, that doesn't mean a whole lot. 3%, what I know is that 3% doesn't feel like a whole lot, right? But if I spin that message and I say, think about these children who don't have access to food, or they don't have access to education, and we are suffering as a nation, and only 3% increase, right? That's a small price to pay for reopening our amazing economy, right? That feels like a more powerful message for saying that we should open our economy and become the world power we deserve to be. If on the flip side we say, okay, going back to school is fine and all, but 3% increase represents, like, this many people will die. That if you had to make the moral and ethical choice to reopen our incredible economy so that even one person dies, right? I want you to think about going and talking to the family of that person and saying that that person's death was worth it so that stockholders could raise their income a little bit, right? You can see where this identifiable victim, this individual victim argument changes the nature entirely. So this is not something that is really a cultural issue. It's a person issue. And it's really an extension of something that we see much more in childhood, but all the way up into adulthood also. I'm going to ask this next question. We're not really going to talk about it, but I'll just get it up into our brain so it's rolling around in the back of your head. Why is talking about death specifically in America a big deal as compared to other countries where it's the norm? How did society evolve to say death was taboo? Take social problems. And if you get a chance to take a class on death and dying in social psychology or in sociology, it's a really great opportunity because there is a lot that we don't talk about with death and end-of-life stuff. And it's a complex explanation for like why we don't talk about these things. But really, it's a fantastic opportunity to explore something that not only do we not talk about, but many of us don't even want to talk about. Okay, so let me switch to the question I got through texting. Again, if you can't get into the chat, just send me a text at 327-8259. Let me see here. The syllabus says that the lowest scoring research and analyze assignment is dropped. I want to make sure that information is true. Yes, it is. If it's not being dropped already, it'll be dropped at the end of the semester. And then a couple of questions about the final and its format. Go ahead and take a look at the beginning of the live stream to get that. Final will be available all next week. It'll be multiple choice and essay in social psychology, I think also in developmental psychology, but not in general psychology. Cool. So let's switch from talking about some course specific information to talking about like psychology generally. This question, that question asker admits, is not about a specific week's material, but I've noticed that being more around my family members, especially my cousins, they tend to copy each other a lot. Even when other ones aren't around, one will continue to make annoying sounds or act like them. They talk about some specific examples here, but they say kind of like one of them is going through puberty, the other one isn't, but acts like them, mimicking their bad behaviors. What does this mean about like bad influence? One of the things that we know from social psychology, but also research into stuff like relationships, is an extension of the mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect says that we like people just by being around them more, right? But we also know that being around people more, we tend to become more similar. We like people who are like us, and then the more we're around them is that... the more that we are around them is that we become more similar to them. Think about people that you've been really good friends with and about how it's like you kind of like slide into being the same person. You maybe there are artists or kinds of music you didn't like, but your friend's listening to it all the time. And the more you listen to it, you're like, you know what? Like I didn't recognize it before, but this is like a bop. Like absolutely. Like now I'm not talking about like Here Kitty Kitty or something like that, that like the first time you hear it, you say this is like brilliant, beautiful music. But something that maybe you really didn't think you'd like before. I think, for example, about, I was not a big fan of country music, but my dad, there was a certain point where he started to listen to some like classic old school country, like old school Hank Williams, right? And riding in the car with him a lot and playing card games with him while he listened to this music, like I started to... get to like stuff, find things in the music that I didn't think I'd like before, start to become like him, and then I'm listening to that music. You start to like the same movies, you start to use the same jokes, you start to use those same phrases. Like I catch myself using phrases that my brother uses or my friends use or my family members use, right? And so this is a really normal, natural thing, and you would expect, right, now that you're in this close contact with other people sharing all of this time, you'll become even more similar. Key thing, take breaks from each other so you don't drive each other too crazy. I got a quick question from someone. I'm not sure if you're actually a class member or not. Whether you are or not, why don't you go ahead and expound a little bit on this question in chat. What happened if you're a psycho? Maybe we know a little bit more about that question. I can start to answer that. Next question. Hey, Professor Keith, do you know anything about working in other countries with a psychology degree from America? I don't know as much about working as a psychologist in other countries, but I do know that we are licensed in the United States, right? You get a degree from an accredited institution, you pass your licensing exam, and that licensing is regulated on the state level. If you are going to go and practice in another country, I think the most important thing you can do is to look at that country's, and then if they're like provinces or local regulations, you really want to be well versed in what those local regulations are like to know whether or not you can practice, what the limitations of that practice are like, and what you can and can't do and how that'll work. The other thing you want to do is know what local customs and perspectives on stuff like psychology are. So generally speaking, people tend to be a fan of stuff like education, but it's not the same when it comes to stuff like mental health and mental wellness. A lot of other cultures and other countries are less open about this stuff. So if you were going to go, for example, and practice in Western Europe versus East Asia or Sub-Saharan Africa, you would want to make sure that you were really well versed in perspectives on psychology and that you understood the local culture. Among other things, there's like a really problematic history of especially like Westerners, especially white Westerners, coming into places like with this perspective that I'm going to come in as the expert and fix everything that's going on here. And as a matter of not just helping people, but really respecting and understanding what's going on, you want to learn a lot about the culture and treat it with the same respect we treat our own. One of my favorite questions of all time, a single sentence here: why do we procrastinate? This is one of my favorite questions because a lot of instructors approach this question the same way that they approach a question like, why do we cheat on tests, right? And the quick answer is to make use of a personal, individual disposition explanation and say, students procrastinate because they're lazy and they're irresponsible, and they cheat because they are morally bankrupt. This is simple and it's easy to answer and it's satisfying. Students cheat because they're lazy, and I don't because I'm not. But this isn't really the case. As somebody who's procrastinated a lot, as someone who's worked with a lot of students who procrastinate, the answer for why we procrastinate is complicated, but it usually starts with we are anxious or we forget something. And procrastination, like, it starts small and it gets big. And ultimately, when we look at the emotions that drive procrastination, it's not laziness, it's anxiety. I remember being in college and procrastinating through the use of Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion. It was a video game. That's all you really need to know. But it was a video game you could do a lot of stuff in. And I remember playing that video game for hours on end, knowing the entire time that I should be working on something else and feeling too stressed to do that. And as a result, I would spend hours playing this video game, enjoying none of it, knowing I should do something else, but too stressed about what I needed to do there. And ultimately, like, I knew that I'd feel better once I got started, but I couldn't get past that anxiety to get started on the thing. And ultimately, what I found was that the one way that helped me to get better at this was to enlist someone else's help, specifically that of my professor, right? So, what I ended up doing was reaching out to my instructor, and I felt like I was, laying myself bare, coming clean, prostrating myself and saying, I'm lazy and I'm horrible and I haven't gotten done any of the work that I thought I needed to get done. And ultimately, what I was met with was not like derision or a lack of understanding or anger, but somebody who said like, yeah, no, that's okay. That happens. We're going to get rid of that anxiety and we're going to lay out a plan to get back on track. And once I did that, I felt so much better. If you yourself are struggling with procrastination, talk to me. And what we'll do is we're going to get rid of the anxiety. We'll put together a solid plan with specific steps to get back on track. And we're just going to take those steps to get back on track. Because one of the things that we all know from, psychology, but real life, is if you know what to do and you know how to do it and you have a plan to get it done, it gets way easier. So we procrastinate mostly because we're stressed, right? But then also that stress gets mixed up with stuff like guilt and shame and fear and stuff. So once we can get rid of that, we're doing way better. Another question, I'm going to jump to chat here really quickly. Question, Stephanie asks, if I wanted to be a counselor for the VA, what degree route is the best to take? I think one of the best things that you can do if you want to know about working in a specific institution is to ask a question of somebody who already works there. We don't, I think, have any counselors working at Santa Fe who work for the VA, but Dr. Ryan Barbeau, if you were to talk with him, and if you want to talk to me, I can get you in touch with him. He works as a clinical psychologist who really knows the landscape very well, what the educational pathway is like. But generally speaking, what you would want to do is get a PhD or a PsyD in psychology. I think that the VA does hire just licensed mental health counselors, which you can get into without a PhD or a PsyD in psychology. A master's in psychology or a master's in social work will work also. But of any of these options, you want to make sure that it's the kind of program that leads to licensure in the state of Florida, right? So you can get a master's in psychology like I did, but my master's program did not prepare me for a licensure in the state of Florida, right? It was a research-oriented program. So we'd want to make sure that we did a master's in social work or a clinical or counseling psychology master's or PhD. I know that that's like a lot of different combinations and permutations, but if you and I were to talk more directly, or I were to get you in touch with Dr. Barbeau, he'd be able to answer those questions about like what the advantages and disadvantages are of each degree option. I know I've plugged Dr. Barbeau's abnormal psychology class in the past and personality psychology class in the past, but if you can jump in and take those classes, it's a real treat. He's a really great guy. I hear nothing but good things from students who take his classes. So yeah, no, he's really good and can answer those questions really well. Of course, I can help give you some more information too, but definitely there. Another kind of general psychology question here. How can social psychology or psychology generally be implemented in distance learning, especially for elementary age students? Being that we are not physically gathering, is it possible to still be socially influenced without being around peers? It is, absolutely. Just watch how people behave in your synchronous Zoom classes, or like if you're to look at your like Zoom classes or Zoom meetings, or kind of like those digital meetings there, like you can see how people are influenced like in those spaces where we can see each other. But even in your online discussions, like in my class, one of the things that we see is that if nobody talks in an online discussion, everybody waits till the last minute. Everybody will continue to wait till the last minute. But if you can get a few students posting early, that can get a snowball effect where everybody posts. But the key thing is that there has to be some level of influence. So if, for example, you've got elementary school aged kids at home and they don't feel that social pressure to get their work done because there aren't online discussions, they're not doing video chats or video classes, none of that social pressure is present from those classes. So you can ask yourself like, well, where's that social pressure going to come from? And the answer will be you. You, your family, their siblings, their cousins, whatever. You know how much easier it is for you to sit still and pay attention when you're in a physical classroom. Everyone's sitting still, facing forward and listening. You can do the same thing with your kids or your cousins or your siblings. You can all get together and do work together. I know one of the things that was really hard for me coming up is that my parents really wanted me to do well on my schoolwork, but we never really did schoolwork together, right? My parents would help where they could. They got tutors when they could, but they wouldn't like sit down with me and just do the work with me. And the few times that they did that, where like my dad would pay bills at the same time I did my classwork, or my mom would do her paperwork at the same time I did my schoolwork, it's like it just felt so much easier to focus and get stuff done because that conformity pressure was right there. It wasn't just compliance, them asking me to do it, or obedience, them telling me to do it. It was them like doing it at the same time, and it just felt comfortable and it felt normal. In contrast to like, think about how uncomfortable it feels for you to try to do schoolwork when everybody else is like playing video games or outside doing stuff or even cleaning or eating, right? It just doesn't feel normal. So if you want to help your kids out or your siblings or cousins or whoever out, like sit down and do the stuff with them, but keep limits in mind. They're not going to be able to focus for the same length of time you are. You might be able to sit and focus and study for 2-3 hours at a time, but they'll be like 15 minutes. Take a little break and then come back to it, right? In the end, you've got to get rid of that expectation you're doing stuff at the same time. So I see Stephanie ask follow-up, like, I hope like you can tell everybody, just Stephanie in the chat, like, scale 1 to 5, how did you like Professor Barbeau's class? Because I think it's pretty good. But you're right, psychology is incredibly broad. It's one of the advantages and disadvantages. But that's where, again, like we could talk specific programs, finding some examples helps. But generally speaking, I would tend to say, look at, if you're looking to do okay, out of 1 to 5, Stephanie says a 10, so that's really good. But I would say look at public universities rather than private schools because they tend to be way more affordable. I'd say if you want to get to practicing right away, I'm not sure what the VA's requirements are, but we could look at them. But if you want to practice right away, I'd say do a master's in social work or a master's in counseling psychology. If you want to have the greatest number of options available to you when it comes to practice, you want to do a PhD or a PsyD in psychology, clinical or counseling psychology. That'll let you research, it'll let you teach, it'll let you run your own practice, it'll let you work in hospitals and prisons and the VA, stuff like that. So like if you wanted to be safe, you'd want to do a PhD or a PsyD. But the biggest difference is that something like a PhD or a PsyD, you're talking like 6-7 years of school versus a master's, which is 2, right? And so those extra 5 years, like, is that worth it to spend 5 years not working, to spend 5 years spending money rather than making money in order to have that degree, right? And that's where like ultimately only your individual career path can answer that question. I've got a couple of questions here specifically about COVID. After listening to the Q&A with an academic advisor, all right, get in and do that if you haven't done already. After listening to the Q&A with an academic advisor, it seems that advisors, professors, and all college administrators are advocating for student mental health, but are they practicing the same advice? I hope to hear that you, Dr. Keith, and other college administrators are staying safe and healthy. So how are we adjusting to these circumstances and taking care of ourselves? Well, one of the things is that we're not as good about taking our advice as we are at giving it. That's kind of a general rule when it comes to advice giving in health and mental health, right? It's a lot harder to take your advice than to give it. But one of the most important things you can do is to set those priorities, social distancing, self-isolation, self-quarantine. This is all really important. But then as much as you can to go ahead and take breaks, take time for yourself, and connect with other people digitally, right? So one of the things that's a big risk right now when it comes to mental health is the risks that we see with isolation. So increased risk of things like depression and anxiety and the consequences of those. Increased risk of like health related stuff. So like if you already lived a sedentary lifestyle, it's way easier to now like sit at home and not do a whole lot. And so making sure that you get time to do things, like that's really, really important. If you can connect with other people, like through Skype or Zoom or FaceTime or Duo, like I'm trying now to have at least once a week video chat with my mom so that she can visit with Grady, right? It's a thing that helps me and helps her, and he has a good time climbing all over the place. But also doing things like doing body weight exercises, doing cardio at home. You can even do that like while watching Netflix with other people, right? So that can be a good way to multitask. But you want to be careful that as you do these things, you don't pull what I know some people have already been pulling, which is to say like, well, quarantine be damned, I can't stop living my life. I'm going to go out and do stuff, right? Because ultimately, like, we can't overcome this virus through sheer force of will. You can't stop giving it power over you because it just has power. And when we go out in public and we don't take precautions and we interact with other people, we put ourselves at risk, we put our family members at risk, but you put people at risk that you don't even know. You can ultimately end up not just being somebody who gets the virus, but you can end up transmitting that virus to other people who are like immunocompromised, who are going through autoimmune disorder treatments, who are going through cancer treatments, who are organ recipients, who are taking anti-rejection medications. All of these people, infants, older adults, they're people that you might not even know, but by deciding that we have to get back too early, we can end up putting all of these people at risk, and at worst, causing them to die, and at best, causing them to be hospitalized, right? So making sure to take time for yourself is really good. One of the things that I have a hard time with is without the physical separation of work and home. Like when you send a text message, it comes through to my phone no matter what time of day it is, right? So it's really easy to not end up drawing those lines and feeling like, it's 7, 8 o'clock at night and I should be emailing and I should be grading, and I don't have that separation. So creating that separation is really important, whether it's for you guys or for us. Next question. Hi, Professor Keith. My question this week is, how do I think the summer is going to pan out if the lockdown gets extended? It's hard to tell if the lockdown is going to get extended or not, but as far as we can tell from college operations, the college has decided to keep everything online, I think, at least through summer A, and that's like classes as well as college personnel and operations. So we want to plan to continue being safe and doing things remotely at least through summer A, if not through summer B. Right now, if I were you guys, I would not be planning, like holding out for which in-person classes you're going to take summer B. I would just like plan for those classes to be online. Also, because we don't really know how this stuff is going to go. Nobody really knows. we don't know what the fall is going to look like either. One of the things we are seeing is that there are a lot of administrators, but also politicians making decisions not based on health data. Whether we're looking at the local, the state, or the national level, there are business owners and politicians who are operating based on what they think and what they believe and what they feel is right, not based on economic data, or not based on economic or health data. And what this means is that there's a lot of push to get back to operation as normal when we can't do that, and to get back to doing those things prematurely. And what we know is that it's possible that if we jump the gun on this, we're going to have another resurgence later in the summer, and perhaps more, like multiple resurgences of COVID in the fall, meaning that it's possible that we end up thinking we're going to go back as normal in the fall, but we end up having to stay online, or we go back as normal and then end up shifting to online the same way we did this semester all over again. So I just say, like, stay flexible, be ready to go. You know, like, we don't know what's going to happen here, but be ready to go online. All right, last question for our live stream today, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up. Got a little bit of good news here. Student asks, I recently confirmed my admission to UF for the summer B term. Excellent, and congratulations. This was a tough decision, but I ultimately decided it would be the best for me. I'm worried I will be too shy and not be able to make any new friends. Do you have any tips for me regarding this? I'm also worried that once I start at UF, my grades will drop because of the harder classes. What are some ways I can avoid this? I love this question because it's a question that I wondered myself when I first went off to college, and then I wondered myself when I went off to graduate school, and then I wondered when I started my first real job, and then when I started another job. When I started my job as an instructor at Santa Fe, even as recently as 7-8 years ago, we'd have to say, I think maybe 8 years ago, when I started at Santa Fe, when I took the Myers-Briggs type inventory, I scored as somebody who was a 100% introvert, which is funny if you've been in classes with me, right? Or if you've worked with me at all. Like, I was 100% an introvert. I totally drained interacting with other people. Today, if I take the Myers-Briggs type inventory, I score as somebody who's like 2/3, 3/4 of the way to being a total extrovert. And it's because of, as much as we think that people don't change and that our personalities just are what they are, ultimately, our personalities are these collections of habits, of behaviors, of thoughts that can be changed the same way that anything else can be changed. If you've learned to floss, if you have learned to exercise, if you have learned to play the guitar on a regular basis rather than just sitting and feeling guilty about not doing what you feel like you should do, you know that these things can change. So one of the things that I learned is that as uncomfortable, as horribly as uncomfortable as it made me to do it, forcing myself to go and talk to other people was a really great way to meet new people and learn new things and make friends. And forcing myself to do that ended up putting me in lots more situations to make friends and have new experiences and learn new things than socially isolating myself would be. Now, social distancing, self-isolation, all of that, absolutely. But you can still reach out to people, for example, like in online settings. Stephanie's right. Fake it till you make it. Absolutely. Like, I faked being an extrovert until, surprise, I was one. Of course, like, having a job where I'm forced to be extroverted helps a lot. But when I go to conferences, I force myself to go and talk to people I don't know. I'll find somebody specifically, I have a formula. I look for someone, one or two people, who are sitting by themselves and not obviously occupied with something else, right? So someone who's scrolling through their phone, for example, and I will go and I'll sit down and I'll talk to them. But here's the deal. You have to know what you're going to talk about. So before you do that, like, I wish I had my notebook here with me, because what you would see is on the first page of my notebook, I did it when I started this notebook, I have a list of questions to ask people. People don't like it when you sit down and just start talking, but they do love to talk about themselves. So you can ask questions like, where are you from? Asking them where they're from, and then you want to have a good open-ended question like, what do they like about it? That's really good. You want to keep it positive. People don't like negativity. They like positivity, right? So ask where they're from, ask what they like about it, ask how they got into the field they're in. Going to the barber is something that used to terrify me because I hated this, like, you're locked into conversation. But I'd prep ahead of time. I would ask, like, how did they become a barber? What did they do beforehand? How did they get into doing that? What are their like favorite movies. And then once you identify like a commonality, and it doesn't even have to be a thing that you really like, right? It can just be like a thing that you know a little bit about. You can talk about that. My current barber is super big into Spider-Man and Marvel movies, and ultimately, like, over this last summer, when Grady was first born and I was up in the middle of the night, I watched all of the Marvel movies back to back because I'd never seen any of them. And ultimately, I watched them because my barber talked about them a lot. One of the things a lot of us are worried about when it comes to talking to other people is that they'll know a lot about something that we won't know about. I'm terrified about this with sports. I'll ask somebody, like, what's going on, and they'll say, like, they're getting ready to go to a baseball game with players I don't know and teams I don't know and rules I don't know. And I'm like terrified of somebody knowing that I don't know something. But here's the thing, like ultimately people love to talk about stuff they know a lot about and they love to feel smart. So if they know a lot about something you don't know about, you can ask them about it. But getting past all this, like you can tell, like I've planned this out the same way I'd plan out a lecture, or I would plan out a strategy in a video game, or I would plan out a project on my house. Like, and it's because like it didn't originally come naturally, but the more that you do it, the better you're going to do, the more enjoyable it'll be, and the more natural it becomes because like anything else, you've practiced it a lot. So like Stephanie says here, you literally like fake it until you make it. And you might not have to fake it a lot, but even in an online class, like you can like, I guess like DM people through Canvas, right? And say, hey, I really like this point that you made. I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about this part of the chapter because I'm confused by it. You ask somebody to be an expert in something that's important to them. So that goes for this class too. It goes for me. I'm happy to be your pal and talk to you about cool stuff, psychology or anything else. But that wraps up our questions for today and our time for today. I thought we were going to do a half hour, but we used up a full hour. Good luck on finals, on everything else. Just because we're wrapping up this official part of the semester doesn't mean we have to be done. If you are worried because you feel like you're behind, reach out to me and ask questions. If you're afraid you're behind, reach out to me and let me know you're behind and that you're worried, and we'll come up with a plan to knock this stuff out together. Of course, you want to remember to knock out test 6 or 7, depending on your class, this weekend, and then be ready for the final next week. If you have questions about the class, about material, about mental health, about your career, about video games, about sports, about anything, just reach out and talk to me, and I'm happy to talk about whatever. You guys know that you can get me through Canvas, through email at ryan.keith@sfcollege.edu, or call or text me at 327-8259. So yeah, I'm kind of sad this is our last one, but go ahead and sign up for my other classes or just hit me up for whatever and we'll talk. I'm your Professor Ryan Keith, and this is Psychology, and thanks a lot for hanging out for our cool live stream Q&As.